Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Holt, and welcome to today's podcast. Today, we are reading a Margaret Atwood poem. Margaret Atwood is a renowned Canadian poet born in 1938. Known for her poems and novels that have been sparked by her passion in environmentalism and human rights. It is Dangerous to Read Newspapers by Margaret Atwood. While I was building neat castles in the sandbox, the hasty pits were filling with bulldozed corpses, and as I walked to the school washed and combed, my feet stepping on the cracks in the cement detonated red bombs. Now I am grown up and literate, and I sit in my chair as quietly as a fuse. And the jungles are flaming. The underbrush is charged with soldiers. The names on the difficult maps go up in smoke. I am the cause. I am a stockpile of chemical toys. My body is a deadly gadget. I reach out in love, my hands are guns. My good intentions are completely lethal. Even my passive eyes transmute everything I look at to the pocked black and white of a war photo. How can I stop myself? It is dangerous to read newspapers. Each time I hit a key on my electric typewriter, speaking of peaceful trees, another village explodes. Alright, so in this poem, we're hearing a speaker who's grappling to understand their role in the horrors of war. This poem was written in 1968, which is around when the Vietnam War was happening. They're speaking in first person, and they're recalling their childhood memories to compare the violence that the speaker was previously impervious to. Now, later in the poem, the speaker expands to include their struggle to comprehend violence as an adult. So the transitional words and phrases that are used in this poem serve to alternate between the first-person point of view and the descriptions of the violence and atrocities that are occurring in the war. Throughout this poem, there's strong contrast between elements of childhood and elements of violence. We see in the first stanza the mention of sandboxes, followed quickly with the mention of corpses, and then in the second stanza, the focus on schools versus this focus on bombs. This creates a tension between creation and destruction, which again we can see later in the poem as they talk about love and guns, buildings and bulldozed, and jungles and flames. The first line of the poem is, "While I was building neat castles in the sandbox." This, off the bat, creates a really innocent and youthful tone. The second line, however, is, "The hasty pits were filling with bulldozed corpses." Now, this is important because it creates a strong contrast off the bat between innocence and death. The diction describing the pits as hasty and then the corpses being described as bulldozed could possibly be an allusion to World War II, as there was a lot of careless destruction with lives, especially regarding concentration camps during this era. In the second stanza of the poem, we read, "Walked to the school, washed and combed." So this is obviously a school-aged child, and then we're talking about like stepping on the cracks in the cement. This is an allusion to child's play, the phrase stepping on your mother's back. So this stanza is strongly about youth and childhood values. Now, the stanza following is a strong contrast, and it says, "Now I am a grown-up." This is signifying the change and maturation in the poem. This is the turning point. What's interesting is that following this, we see polysyndeton start the next stanza. It reads, "And the jungles are flaming." So the polysyndeton and creates like this effect where it's just another thing is adding on, creating this overwhelming effect of war. It signifies the speaker who represents the American citizen's frustration, and is a commentary on maybe man's just violent inherent nature. The Vietnam War was happening as this poem was written, and in the same stanza as before, we read that the names of the difficult maps go up into smoke. This is most likely an allusion to the destruction of small villages that happened during this time period, once again just bringing the themes of war back into this poem. The next stanza starts with, I am the cause. So this begins the section of the poem that is reflection, and this is where we see the culmination of guilt arise in the speaker. It's followed by, my body is a deadly gadget. I reach out in love, my hands are guns. My good intentions are completely lethal. These represent hopelessness and how the individual, regardless of their own personal beliefs in the war, so they're being represented and protected by their country, which is engaged in violence. So they're really feeling guilty as to what their country's doing, what mankind is doing, but they're helpless to the situation. So in the next stanza, we read black and white of a war photo. If we imagine a photo being taken of the war, it's almost as if the author is immortalizing the violence, and as if to say, mankind's behavior will forever go on. It's a representation of the longevity of their actions. And also by saying black and white with war, we're talking about making an oversimplification. The speaker is saying how violence has always happened and will always continue to happen in a really hopeless manner. They end the stanza by reading, it is dangerous to read newspapers. So this is a repetition of the title, which before had little to no meaning and seemed like it was ironic. But now, given that we have more context, it makes sense to the audience. Because to a member of the American middle class, the events that are going on in a war are not going to affect them or reach them unless they're picking up that newspaper and making themselves aware, introducing new information into their reality that's going to create guilt, and it's going to expose them to violence. Hence why it is dangerous to read newspapers. So the poem ends by saying, each time I hit a key on my electric typewriter, speaking of peaceful trees, another village explodes. This is ending on a really negative and hopeless note, basically saying how even the most well-intended actions of the middle class ultimately are not going to have an impact on the outcome of the war. That the American citizens are hopeless to the destruction, even if they would want it to stop. It doesn't seem plausible. Whatever they can do, whatever they can say to describe peace, as soon as they finish that, another village can explode. Violence will still persist. So throughout the poem, Atwood is making allusions to the wars that the United States had been involved in. The most recent two of these had been the Cold War, World War II, and the Vietnam War. The Cold War was made an allusion on line 8 when they talk about detonating red bombs, red representative of the communist flag, and then the Vietnam War is alluded to when talking about the underbrush being charged with soldiers and the names of difficult maps going up in smoke, and that's in the 4th stanza. And then in the 1st stanza, we see the allusion to World War II with the pits of corpses. Atwood also uses youth as a metaphor for ignorance and innocence. In the first section of the poem, when it's focused on childhood elements, this is when the audience is still unaware of the horrors of war. So it's only after the speaker says, now I am a grown up, in the third stanza, that they're really contextualizing what's happening in the world and the role they play in it. This is when the guilt is finally sinking in, whereas before, the speaker was blissfully ignorant in their own childhood duties. So, overall, the poem has a negative tone. It's disconcerting, it's startling, hopeless, and cynical. The speaker clearly doesn't have hope that mankind will get better in the future, and they see the violence continuing, which is why really dark diction is used, like bulldozed corpses, detonated red bombs, another village explodes is the way the poem actually ends. And then they do say that they are the cause. They say, I am the cause. I am a stockpile of chemical toys. Now, the speaker itself is, again, a representation of the American citizen, so they don't actually think that they are personally responsible for the war, but by saying, I am the cause, they're saying humans are the cause. So the poem was focused on war specifically, but I found that the poem could be applied to other concepts. Because the poem was mostly about inherent human evils and how the middle class or people not affected are going to respond to that. For example, the climate crisis is ongoing, but not everyone is affected in equal ways, so observing how some groups of people who are not affected will respond in efforts to help others despite the actions of big corporations. That's a parallel that can be applied to this poem. Because the core of this poem, which is how people respond to being exposed to violence and other atrocities, can be universally applied to many different scenarios. Thank you for listening to today's poem, It is Dangerous to Read Newspapers by Margaret Atwood. While I was building neat castles in the sandbox, the hasty pits were filling with bulldozed corpses. And as I walked to the school, washed and combed, my feet stepping on the cracks in the cement detonated red bombs. Now, I am a grown-up and literate, and I sit in my chair as quietly as a fuse. And the jungles are flaming, the underbrush is charged with soldiers, the names on the difficult maps go up in smoke. I am the cause. I am a stockpile of chemical toys. My body is a deadly gadget. I reach out in love. My hands are guns. My good intentions are completely lethal. Even my passive eyes transmute everything I look at to the pocked black and white of a war photo. How can I stop myself? It is dangerous to read newspapers. Each time I hit a key on my electric keyboard, speaking of peaceful trees, another village explodes.